Okay, thank you everybody for tuning into this. I'm Marcus Holmes. I'm Associate Professor of Government here at William & Mary. I also am Academic Director of the William & Mary St. Andrews Joint Degree Program. Today I want to talk a little bit about this election that's coming up. And you might have heard that we have an election in a few weeks, and we could talk a little bit about how Donald Trump, if he wins, his foreign policy will continue a lot of the things that he's been doing already, obviously, and how it might be different if Joe Biden becomes president. And I think there are a number of differences between these two. But today I actually want to focus in an area where they actually happen to agree quite a bit. And that's on shared views regarding the importance of face-to-face diplomacy, or some might call personal diplomacy. The idea of basically going out and interacting with an ally or an adversary in order to get a better sense of what they're up to, build trust, build understanding, and all that kind of stuff. Now, as you might know, with Donald Trump, he's a big believer in personal diplomacy, and it's been a very busy few years for face-to-face diplomacy. So, depending on your politics, these are either famous examples or infamous examples, but in either case, it shows that Donald Trump is really a big believer in personally reaching out to his counterparts, whether it's the summit with Kim, the sort of Helsinki summit where there's that famous exchange of the soccer ball. We have the handshake heard around the world with Trudeau. And then whatever was going on here, I'm not sure exactly what was happening here with Macron. But the basic idea is simple, which is that Donald Trump, like a lot of presidents, actually is a firm believer in face-to-face diplomacy and reaching out to allies and adversaries around the world. Now, I just wrote a book on this topic, actually, and as part of the research, I went and I interviewed a lot of diplomats and ambassadors and former heads of state, some current officials. And a lot of times they looked at me like I was a little silly, right? And they were sort of like, well, why are you writing a book about face-to-face diplomacy? It's so obvious that face-to-face diplomacy is important. Focus your attention, Professor Holmes, on something else, right? This is obvious. And so what I want to do is sort of think about why political scientists actually don't think that face-to-face diplomacy is obviously an important aspect of world politics, and think through some of the reasons why they're a little bit skeptical of this. And I want to do this through a story. And the story goes back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and more specifically 1945. So on this date, January 20th, he was giving his fourth inauguration address. And this is back when you run for president 4 times. And if you know anything about FDR, at this point in his life, his health was not great. Actually, he on the day of the inauguration, he was actually feeling quite sick, and his physical appearance was not great. His son, James, in a nice sort of vote of confidence, as he's about to go out and give his talk, says, Dad, you look like hell. So it gives you an indication of how bad things were. Now, they do this inauguration speech not at the Capitol, but at the White House. And there's a couple different reasons for that. Number one, it's 1945, so the country's at war. They don't want to have a big sort of pomp and circumstance type of celebration event. But the other more practical thing that's going on here is that they wanted to be able to shield FDR a little bit from the cameras. So they didn't like the optics of having basically a sick U.S. president give his inauguration address. And, they could sort of hide him behind the American flag. They could hide, a lot of the sort of visuals from the reporters. In his speech, he talks about finding a lasting peace in the world. Because he doesn't feel that great, it's a relatively short speech, just over 500 words. But he's talking about sort of how the world is going to get over World War II. What's going to happen in the post sort of World War II era. Now, after the ceremony, and he gives a speech, he talks to his son, and he tells him where his will and his funeral arrangements are located. The reason he does this is he's going on a very important voyage. The voyage is going to take him down, past Williamsburg, down to Newport News, Virginia. He travels in an armored train down to Newport News from Washington. From Newport News, he hops on the USS Quincy, and he travels across the Atlantic Ocean to Malta. Now, there's a couple different problems with this trip. The first one is that there are still German U-boats mining the Atlantic, so they have these security concerns. They have to watch out for these boats, make sure they don't run into any trouble. But the other problem is his health. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on a boat when you're sick. It's not the most pleasant thing in the world, and for FDR, it was really unpleasant, right? Because it's a long trip, it's 11 nights, and he's on this boat when his condition is continuing to deteriorate. They get to Malta, and what they do is FDR has a rendezvous with Winston Churchill. And what he does in this rendezvous is essentially work out his negotiation strategy, because what they're going to do next is travel to Yalta, where they're going to have the infamous Yalta summit with Joseph Stalin. So they sit down, they basically come up with a strategy, they talk about their interests and how they're going to try to negotiate peace and all that kind of thing. And then eventually they leave a few days later for Crimea on the Sacred Cow aircraft. The problem with that is that it's a very sort of propeller-type plane, and again, it doesn't help to help FDR's condition. So what's interesting is when they finally get to Crimea, they land here on an airstrip on the western part of the peninsula, and it's a place called Saki. And it's a long drive to Yalta. And originally when I was doing research for this book, I was trying to figure out, why in the world would they land so far away from where they were ultimately going, because there are airstrips here that they could have landed in, right? And it turns out the reason that they did this is the Soviets wanted to put on a show. And the show was basically having FDR and Churchill travel in the 20 miles per hour down these roads that were lined with Soviet soldiers, right? So they had these Soviet limousines, and they had the Soviet soldiers kind of lining the streets in order to show the Western leaders that they, had a really, really nice, thing going on here. They had a very strong, military, and they had these nice cars and all that kind of stuff. The problem is that, it's not very pleasant for the two people who are taking part of this. Churchill, after about an hour, yells out, "Christ, 5 more hours of this?" FDR, again, not really having a great time given his condition. Now, his condition is actually so bad that the Soviet doctors take note of it. And they take note that FDR does not look good. And there's some discussion actually about just how sick he is and whether he's going to be able to make this trip, which is, it's a terrifying prospect, right? The idea that you have a U.S. president who's sort of in peril in the Soviet Union, right? This is not really a good situation. So what ends up happening, of course, is they get to Yalta and they have their sort of famous Yalta summit. And what history will show from this summit essentially is that at least from the West's perspective, from the United States' perspective, from FDR's perspective, this was a disappointment. That at the end of the day, basically Stalin essentially lied to FDR on a couple of different issues, including the future of Poland, right? And so one of the things that political scientists take from stories like this, take from these historical examples of these high-profile summits, these high-profile examples of face-to-face diplomacy, is that at the end of the day, diplomacy is kind of cheap talk, right? And what I mean by that is, if you're in a face-to-face interaction with somebody, even in a whole high-profile place like Yalta, you can really say whatever you want. There's not a whole lot in international politics to force you to back up what you're saying, right? In other words, face-to-face diplomacy is essentially things that leaders engage in where they exchange maybe promises or ideas or other things like that, but there's nothing to hold them account, right? There's nothing backing up what they're saying. It essentially is just talk. So this, as we know, can have very devastating consequences, right? So the Yalta Summit was not great for FDR, at least on a couple different issues. We also know historically that other summits have gone, very poorly, or other meetings have gone very poorly. This is Neville Chamberlain meeting with Adolf Hitler. He went to see if Hitler could be sort of convinced not to take over Europe, essentially. He went to see what Hitler would sort of agree to, and he thought he had a deal with Hitler, right? He thought that he understood very well what Hitler's aims were. And he thought they were pretty limited, right? It turns out he was wrong. And that would have devastating consequences, not just for Britain, but indeed, a lot of the world, right? So it's not just, though, that this lying is a big problem. It's also difficult to convey sincerity. One of the examples I'm going to talk about in a second is at the end of the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan sat down at a bunch of different summits, and they tried to convince the other side that their aims were not offensive. In other words, both sides were trying to tell the other, we don't have any intention of striking you. We don't have any intentions of attacking you first. We don't have any intention of being aggressive towards you. The problem is that neither side had any real incentive to believe that, right? Because you don't want to be the one that gets it wrong, right? You don't want to be the sucker who says, oh, okay, I think they're telling me the truth, and I'm just going to, take my nuclear weapons and go home, right? It doesn't work that way. So even when you're trying to convey sincerity, it can be very difficult to convince the other side that you're serious. Now, political scientists know all about this, and they've devised a couple of different ways to get around it. One of them is the idea of sending a costly signal. So the idea here is simply, instead of just saying something is important to us, instead of just saying we're going to do X, Y, Z, let's attach a cost to it. Let's do something costly. Let's spend a little money or spend something to sort of back up what it is that we are saying, right? Some people say that with North Korea, for example, if the United States wanted to reassure North Korea that our intentions were not to take over their regime and not to take out Kim, one of the things we could do is remove some troops from South Korea. I don't personally think that's a great idea, but that is an exercise that would have a cost attached to it. In other words, the United States would be materially limiting what it can do by removing some troops from South Korea, and that would send a signal, a costly signal, to the North Koreans that we're serious, right? But without some type of cost, you basically just have cheap talk. So this is one of the reasons why political scientists are kind of skeptical of diplomacy. Without any cost attached to it, not really obvious that it can do a whole lot. And I think ultimately what this kind of boils down to is that a lot of political scientists would argue that political interests are found in things like security or maybe power, right? These are the things that states care about. And you're not going to get those things in diplomacy, right? It's hard to believe that actually Trump could have said anything to Kim, any words that would convince him that Trump and the United States did not have any sort of aggressive intentions towards North Korea, right? It's just really hard to figure out what those words could be that would convince somebody that they were truthful, right? On the other hand, we do know that nuclear weapons, for example, provide a lot of security. So one of the reasons why North Korea might want a nuclear weapon is just to prevent an invasion, to keep the regime going, right? It might have nothing to do with the ability to attack the United States or Japan or South Korea. It might simply be, we don't want to be invaded. Having a nuclear weapon kind of prevents that, right? So, but at the end of the day, nuclear weapons provide security, not words, right? And so that's another reason why a lot of political scientists are skeptical of face-to-face diplomacy. And I think the last problem is that the future is very much uncertain, right? And this is a problem, obviously, for any kind of politics, but in international politics, it's particularly acute. Because even if you get convinced at some point to do something like give up, chemical weapons, or give up weapons of mass destruction, or give up nuclear weapons, and that deal that you make might make a lot of sense today, the future is very much uncertain, right? It might very well be the case that in 5 years, in a decade, in 3 decades, or 100 years from now, something's going to be different. There's going to be new people in power. The structure of the system's going to change. And that's going to mean the decision that you made, while it might have made sense at a time in the past, doesn't make sense anymore. And so that's another reason why even if you craft the most beautiful deal in the world, it doesn't necessarily mean that in the future it's going to look so great. So I think what we can do is take these 3 ideas that political scientists use to kind of discount the idea of face-to-face diplomacy and stipulate them as sort of the 3 horsemen, right? The three horsemen that doom face-to-face diplomacy, which is to say, political interests are not in diplomacy, they're in security. It's difficult to signal your intentions, and on the flip side, it can be easy to lie. And then finally, that future uncertainty means that any deal you craft is just not going to be that worthwhile, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. Now, I think most political scientists, people who study international politics, would take from these 3 horsemen the idea that, okay, so maybe face-to-face diplomacy at best is kind of irrelevant, right? At best, these guys are engaging, and women are engaging in interactions that, they might be symbolically interesting. It might be good for a photo op. But in terms of substance, in terms of actually solving problems in the international system, really not doing that much. It's just sort of irrelevant stuff, right? At worst, though, these can be incredibly dangerous. So we think about Yalta, basically the start of the Cold War. We think about Munich, getting Hitler wrong and then seeing the consequences of that. These can be devastating, right? So political scientists, for that reason, I think, say, face-to-face diplomacy, either irrelevant or completely dangerous. Either one of those is not great, okay? So that's the backdrop to which I'm sort of responding, right? So when I talk to diplomats and leaders and stuff, and they point out why face-to-face interaction is important, I say, yeah, but political scientists have historically disagreed. There's only one problem with this, and that is whether it's Ambassador Johann von Twist on his way to visit the Sultan of Biajpur in India 1637, or this wonderful relationship between President Obama and President Putin that we recently experienced. One of the fascinating things is that leaders and diplomats travel the globe to go meet with one another, and they've been doing so since at least the 14th century. You can go back in history and find even examples before that of people taking seriously the idea that I need to go meet with the other side. I need to sit down with my counterpart in order to hash out an agreement, right? So they've been doing this for a very long time. They swear by the usefulness of it. If you go talk to a diplomat or an ambassador or a head of state, and you ask them, do you think face-to-face diplomacy is important? They'll go on and on and on about how important it is for building trust, for building intention, understanding, and things like that, right? So you have the people who actually do international politics saying it's very important, and yet for the reasons that I just talked about, the scholars of international politics have downplayed its significance. So what this means, in effect, is either leaders are incredibly naive, and they're doing all these things that just at the end of the day don't matter, or could very well be dangerous, or alternately, political scientists are wrong. And what I want to argue today, and I argue in this book that I just recently wrote, political scientists are the one that I think are wrong, right? I think political leaders are on to something. They might not always be able to articulate exactly what it is that the face-to-face diplomacy gives you, but I think they're right, and I think the political scientists are wrong. Now, the way I'm going to make this argument is in a couple different steps. So first of all, when we think about those 3 horsemen, what I'm going to argue is that at the end of the day, that kind of boils down to this broader problem that we talk about in international politics as the problem of intentions. Basic idea that's really hard to communicate your intentions to the other side. And face-to-face diplomacy, I'm going to suggest, allows for intention transmittal with a fairly high degree of precision, right? That basically what face-to-face interaction is useful for is clarifying your intentions. And we'll get into some of the reasons why. I'm also going to show you that there might be some evidence in neuroscience that actually point out a causal mechanism in the brain, which is to say we have certain architecture in our brains as human beings that facilitate intention understanding. And if there's a specific reason we have this, I think, and that's to make sure that we can empathize with one another. That social interaction is easier if I have some understanding of what your intentions are and you have some understanding of what my intentions are as well. Now, what I think is kind of neat about this is that individuals are often able to transmit information about their intentions, even one, when they don't know that they're doing so, and two, when they don't want to, right? So anybody that's played poker, for example, knows that people have sort of tells, and you can kind of get an idea of what's going on in somebody by their body language. I think similar things are going on in international politics as well in these face-to-face meetings, which I'll talk about. And then finally, there's some evidence, it's limited evidence, but there's some evidence in a face-to-face interaction you can actually pick up on certain types of deception as well. And that becomes important for thinking about why it is that some of these instances fail so spectacularly, but other times actually work out really well, and leaders are able to pick up on the cues and the nuances that might sort of convey to you that the person's not being as truthful as you might want them to be. All of this to say, in the end, I think what's happening is that policymakers and diplomats are not wrong to argue that face-to-face interaction is really important. I think they're right. I just think that they haven't really had the sort of psychological and neuroscientific evidence to argue why before. And so that's kind of what I want to give you today. All right, so here's the basic plan. I'm going to try to do this in not too long of a period of time. Problem intentions, I'm going to go over what that is very briefly. And then I'm going to talk about some evidence from psychology and neuroscience that suggests that we can overcome this problem of intentions. And then at the very end, I want to do a very short illustration from the Cold War. It actually involves Gorbachev and Reagan, which I alluded to a second ago, and basically show you how I think the argument works in that particular case. Okay, so the Three Horsemen. Let's go back to those for a second. What are these fundamentally about? I think if we take a step back and are a little bit more sort of abstract in our thinking about this, at the end of the day, all three of these are about intentions, okay? So the origins of political interest, intentions do not come from, nor do they change through diplomacy, right? There's nothing that Trump and Kim are going to do in a meeting that are going to change what the United States or the North Korea interests are. Just not happening, right? Number two, problems of signaling. The issue here is that it's difficult to convey sincere intentions to one another, and it might be easy to convey deceptive ones. Again, the problem is intentions. I just can't transmit to you what my intentions are. You can't transmit what your intentions are to me. I have reasons to think you're lying. You have reasons to think I'm lying, and then we're stuck, right? And then the future uncertainty problem. Intentions can change. Very simple. People change. States, undergo transformations. All kinds of things can change in the future, meaning intentions can change. So fundamentally, then, what we're left with is this basic idea that intentions are just really thorny, really difficult to understand. Indeed, you can make a good argument that a lot of wars have been fought over this sort of misperception of the other side's intentions. I assume that they have bad intentions. I go to war because of it. I turn out probably to be wrong, or maybe I'm right every once in a while. But at the end of the day, this is a very thorny issue for international politics. We just can't with any certainty convey our intentions to the other side. Now, if we think about the intentions problem, I think, again, taking another step back and thinking more abstract about that, this becomes a problem actually about human beings. And that is to say, if you think about what intentions are things that exist in one's mind. They're sort of mental states. They're kind of beliefs, right? They're things that people have hidden away in their brains. And because we're not mind readers, we don't have access to those things, right? So the problem with North Korea, for example, is that there's only a couple people in this world, theoretically, who know why North Korea wants a nuclear weapon. Do they want a nuclear weapon so they can be safe and secure and prevent a U.S. invasion some point down the road? Or ultimately, do they want a nuclear weapon so they can use it against South Korea, against Japan, against the west coast of the United States, against Alaska, against Guam? The only people who know the answer to that question, presumably, live in North Korea. And because we don't have access to their minds and what's going on inside their heads, we can discuss that question and debate that question until we're blue in the face. We're never going to know, right? So intentions at the end of the day kind of boil down to this broader problem, which is the problem of other minds, right? The problem of other minds is I don't have access to your mind. And so therefore, I don't know what's going on in your head. And consequently, because I don't know what's going on in your head, I don't know what your intentions are. So whether it's an intention to go to a particular restaurant tonight or why you have a nuclear weapon, if I can't access what's going on in your mind, I don't know what your intentions are, right? So the problem of intentions kind of boils down to a bigger issue. Philosophically, we're not mind readers. We can't read minds, right? Now, I think at some level, most people intuitively accept that, right? Yeah, that's true, can't read minds, right? But psychology and neuroscience over the last 4 or 5 decades have really started to actually problematize that position, right? And the reason they problematize it is I think actually quite simple, which is to say, it turns out, if you think about it, we do kind of have access to the minds of other people. I mean, this is the basis of what empathy is, right? Your ability to understand what's going on with somebody else means at some level you have access to what's going on inside their mind. Your ability to have a social interaction with somebody means I have some understanding of what's going on inside in your head, and you have some understanding of what's going on inside in my head, right? So psychology has kind of said, well, maybe sort of it's true at some level that we're not mind readers, but gosh, it does seem like we can do a fairly decent job of understanding what's going on in the head of other people. So how do we make sense of this? How do we understand how we can have something like understanding and empathy, but also have this bigger problem of other minds? Seems like there's a disconnect there. Well, turns out over the last 50, 60 years, there's been a lot of sort of chipping away at this problem of other minds. And I want to give you some examples in the literature that I think are important. So in the 50s and 60s, you start to see a lot of evidence come out about the importance of nonverbal communication. So this is, you see sometimes these studies where they say things like, 60% of communication is nonverbal, or 55% is nonverbal. It's hard to quantify this stuff. I mean, whether it's 60, 55. The point is that things like my wild gesticulations, for example, reveal something about me. It reveals something about what I'm thinking. My expressive behaviors reveal something about what might be going on inside my mind, right? So in other words, it's not just the fact that I say something that reveals what I'm thinking. It's also the case that when I'm saying things, I have facial expressions, I have expressive behavior that gives you a better sense of what's actually going on in my body and what goes on in my mind. And that's happening because I can see it. So I can visually see what the expressions are. And then in the 1980s and the 1990s, business administration scholars started to realize that face-to-face interaction might be a little bit different than other ways of having interaction with people. So, for example, if you put people in a couple different conditions and have them negotiate for a car, for example, right? In a face-to-face condition versus a condition where they have to write letters or they have to even talk on the phone, turns out you get better ability to understand what the other side is thinking in terms of their better bottom line in the face-to-face condition. You also get more trust building in those conditions. You get better empathy in those conditions. And some evidence to suggest you actually can pick up on when the other side is being deceptive. We're going to go over some of the evidence later, but I just want to point that out at the moment, which is face-to-face interaction in these studies shows the ability to pick up on little bits of deception. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, what we see is a movement towards thinking about what's going on in the brain and the body at a subconscious level. So this is where you start to see the sort of importance of subconscious automatic processing. Daniel Kahneman has this famous distinction. It goes back before Daniel Kahneman, but it's basically the idea that there's two systems in our minds, in our brain. One is system one, which he talks about as a very fast system. It's a fast way of thinking. And system two is very slow. It's a sort of reflective, slower, more conscious type of processing. The important part of this is that we spend most of our lives in system one. And we spend most of our lives in system one because metabolically it's much easier to have this sort of fast automatic response than the slow having to think through and sort of be metabolically, ingrained and try to understand what's going on at a slow reasoning perspective. So we spent our time in system one because it's easier. But because it's easier and fast and automatic, it means that we're doing things that sometimes we're not even aware of. So for example, in face-to-face interaction, people tend to mimic one another. If I'm tapping my foot, somebody else might start tapping their foot when they're interacting with me. Or if I yawn, another person might yawn. Or if I touch my hair a lot, another person might touch their hair. In other words, things are going on in these face-to-face interactions. They're just kind of weird. And they're kind of unexplainable, but they start to add up over time. Over decades, people start to realize face-to-face is just different. A lot of odd stuff going on in these face-to-face interactions, where if you put it all together, starts to kind of make sense of this idea of where empathy might be coming from. There are subconscious and conscious things that are going on when we interact face-to-face that give us clues about the other person that might be relevant to understanding what's going on in their mind. Now, one of my favorite sort of pieces of evidence that I think ties a lot of this together actually was a discovery in the 1990s that was by complete accident. And the accident it's actually kind of funny. What happened was you had a neuroscientist in Italy, and what he was doing was looking at the motor function of monkeys. Okay? So he had a monkey set up in an fMRI machine, which basically is measuring the blood flow in the brain. And what he had the monkey do was reach out to grab a banana. And when the monkey reached out to grab a banana, the fMRI lit up. And the neuroscientist said, okay, great. Now I know where the motor function is coded in the brain for grabbing a banana. We thought the experiment was done. Okay? At the end of the experiment, the researcher, the neuroscientist, reached out to grab the banana from the monkey. And it turns out that the fMRI lit up again. You thought, that's weird. What's going on there, right? And it was lighting up in the same place that it lit up before. So he did what you would expect him to do. He sort of cleaned off the electrodes and rebooted the computer and make sure there's no problems, and he did it over and over again. And it turns out this was a stable outcome, which is every time the monkey would reach out to grab a banana, i.e. when the monkey would do an action, or when the monkey saw somebody else do an action, the same neurons were firing in the brain. So eventually these things became mirror neurons, because what essentially was happening was action and observation of an action were functionally equivalent in the brain. In other words, when the monkey did something and the monkey saw something happen, the way that the monkey understood what it was seeing was actually doing it for itself, right? So observing an action and acting an action were using the same exact set of neurons. That's pretty interesting. That's pretty cool, right? Okay, so then what they did is they said, all right, let's go see how nuanced these things actually are. Let's see how robust these things are, right? And it turns out they were pretty robust, right? So they did another series of studies where they had the monkey hooked up to the same machine, same fMRI, and they said, all right, let's test these neurons out a little bit, okay? So up here what you see is they basically set the monkey up with a situation where it could see a box, okay? And then the human hand reached out to grab the box. And because the mirror neurons were seeing that there was an intentional, specific action there, they fired a lot, right? In other words, the neurons were firing because it was seeing the hand reach and grab the box. It's a very specific, intentional act. It was understanding that action through the neuron. In slide 2 here, what they did was they showed the monkey that there was no box. The human hand reached out to grab, no box. The neurons said, wait a second, there's no specific intentional action here. There's nothing to understand. Very little firing. Then the researchers said, okay, that's interesting. Let's up the ante a little bit. Let's show the monkey that there's a box, but then let's put a screen over the box. So the monkey knows there's a box there, but it can't really see it, right? Then the human hand reaches behind the screen, grabs the box, and what happens is the neurons fire even though the monkey can't physically see exactly what's going on. In other words, the neurons knew that even though it was sort of implicit that there was a box there, the neurons knew that there was an intentional, specific action that needed to be understood, encoded, and that's why they fired. And then in the last study, what they did was they showed the monkey that there's no box. They put the screen over, no box. The human hand went behind the screen to grab, no box. Same thing as in number 2 above, no box, monkey knows it, neurons don't fire nearly as much, right? Okay, so what does this mean? What this seems to suggest is that these neurons are firing for very specific, intentional actions, okay? So whether they're sincere actions like this one where they know exactly what they're seeing, or whether they're sort of hidden actions like this one, they're smart enough to kind of pick up on when things are implicit, but not immediately obvious, right? In other words, they're picking up on the kind of hidden nuance of what's going on, which I think is kind of cool. Okay. Now, that's monkeys. In human beings, these are linked to other types of behaviors, right? So the same thing is going on in terms of the action, but the other thing that's happening with the mirroring system in the brain is helping us understand facial expressions and micro expressions, okay? What are facial expressions? Well, we all know what facial expressions are, but the important thing is that when you see a face that's surprised, or you see a face that's happy or sad, what's engaged is that system 1 that I was talking about a few minutes ago, right? You don't have to think to yourself, is this a happy face? Is this a surprise face? You just know. And the reason you know is because what's going on in your brain, if the mirror neurons are right, is you're actually simulating what that facial expression is like for yourself, right? So in other words, we know surprise because our neurons are doing surprise in our own heads. We know anger because we're simulating anger for ourselves. We don't necessarily feel anger, although there's some instances where seeing a face that's in pain, for example, might actually have you feel a little bit of pain too. But in most instances, we don't actually experience in a sort of conscious way the emotion, but we're experiencing it in a subconscious way. A simulative kind of way is how we understand what these things are. It's how we understand what the facial expressions are. Now, what this means is that essentially, to understand a face, to understand what's going on in a face, we're simulating that facial expression for ourselves, and that allows us to know what's going on inside the head of another person to a certain degree, right? Clearly, this is just an emotional thing, but it's an emotional thing that might be relevant, right? So in other words, if I'm talking to you and we're negotiating over a car or something, and I have the ability to pick up on the emotion that is attached to the words that you're saying, that could be relevant information that gives me a clue as to what you're thinking, right? That gives me a clue as to how serious you are, gives me a clue as to how trustworthy you might be, for example, and so all that's relevant. Now, this is a very overt facial expression, right? The other thing that these neurons have been linked to is the idea of micro-expressions. Now, micro-expressions are the very minute changes that happen in a face when you're talking to somebody or you're looking at a video of somebody that are almost imperceptible. And because they're imperceptible, it's hard to show you on a slide, but I want to give you a couple examples that have been exaggerated just so you can kind of get the point, right? So for example, this is a face that's computer generated that's relatively low trusting. This is a more trusting face. This is a more trusting face. This is a face that's relatively low threat, not a very threatening face. This is a more threatening face. This is a more threatening face than that one. Less threatening, more threatening. Less threatening, more threatening. Now, you'll note what changes here is very subtle, right? We're talking about very subtle changes in the way that the nose looks, changes in the way that the lips are, the ears, the eyes, et cetera, right? So the point here is that while these have been sort of exaggerated for illustration purposes, what's happening at a subconscious level also are the subtle micro-expressions that we give off in behavior, right? When we're interacting with somebody and we're sort of making very small changes in our face that I can't really articulate to you what's going on, but I get a sense. I understand kind of what's happening. Now, one of the interesting things about micro-expressions is that a lot of psychologists point out these are very difficult to control. In other words, when I'm interacting with somebody, I can control my overt facial expressions. If I'm sad, I can pretend to be happy, right? I can do things on my face to make it seem like I'm happy. It's much more difficult to control these really subtle ones. And so for that reason, people talk about microexpressions as being like a really important kind of nuanced cue as to what's going on. Because if I know that you can't control what I'm picking up on, well, that means that actually it's more important, right? Because I know you're not faking it. If you can't control it, it's more like a window into what's going on inside your mind, right? And I think for that reason, the microexpressions are really kind of critical. I mentioned a few minutes ago that people have suggested that in face-to-face interactions you can pick up on deception. And I don't want to leave you with the idea that this is a foolproof way of detecting deception, right? A lot of this stuff is completely overblown. So they have these shows like Tell Me a Lie and the idea that you can kind of look in somebody's eye and see if they're lying to you and all that kind of stuff. I don't buy a lot of that. But what I do buy is the more subtle, more nuanced findings that there is something interesting that happens in face-to-face sort of visual settings that do give people sometimes an uneasy feeling that the other side might not be being completely truthful. One of my favorite experiences that illustrates this, they had people watch a video clip, very quick, 3.5 seconds, and in that video clip you see a woman reach down to grab a box and pick it up. Now, what the people watching did not know is that in some In some instances, that box was actually heavy. So they put a bunch of books in it. The woman had to pick it up, and it was heavy, right? In another condition, the woman was told, okay, that box is not going to be heavy, but I want you to pretend like it is. Okay? So in other words, in one condition that she's picking up a heavy box that's actually heavy, and in the other condition she's picking up a box that isn't heavy, but she has to pretend like it is. Okay? And then the person looking at this then after the 3.5 second video has to determine whether that was a really heavy box or that was a fake heavy box. And it turns out that people, most people anyway, have a better than 50-50 shot of getting it right. Okay? So it's not a huge effect, but it's better than 50-50. So it's better than chance, right? And what's interesting is afterwards, if you talk to the people who got it right and you ask them, you say, look, you got that right. You picked up on the fact that that box wasn't heavy. How did you do that? How did you know that? They have an awfully hard time articulating what it is, right? They'll say things like, well, it just didn't look right, or, there was something fishy about the way that she was doing it. And because it's above chance, they're not just guessing, right? It's statistically significant that it's not just a guess, right? So, I picked this up and I can't really articulate whether that's heavy or why I think that's heavy, but I have a sense in my brain, I have a sense in my mind of why that might be, right? And so the reason it might be is because the importance of the thing that I was just talking about a second ago, which is these sort of nuanced nonverbal behaviors that we have difficulty controlling, but nevertheless kind of reveal something about ourselves, right? So here, the emotional expression might be kind of relevant, but the micro-expressions might be relevant, or just the other types of behaviors that are very subtle in nature that just don't quite add up, to being truthful, also relevant. Now, I mentioned a second ago that deception detection is very difficult. If it was easy, games like poker wouldn't be possible, right? So we know this from social life, that it's not like we have these sort of deception detection radars that are built into us. But research has suggested that there's a couple different things that are sort of correlated with the ability to pick up on deception, and things that are correlated with the inability. Narcissism is correlated with the inability to pick up on deception, right? So in other words, the more narcissistic you are, the less likely you are to be able to pick up on deception in these types of experiments, right? That might be relevant for international politics as well. So I want to sort of now take a step back, because we've gotten kind of in the weeds in terms of some of these findings, and think about what all this means. Okay, what does this mean for thinking about social interaction? Well, I think what it means is that these neurons, the discovery of this mirroring system, suggests the type of way that we understand the other person through social interaction that has to do with simulation of observed, specific, intentional behavior. Which is to say, we have the ability to, in face-to-face context, through the mirroring system, get a sense of the other person that might not be on the conscious level, but it's on the subconscious level. Okay? And I think that's relevant for thinking why face-to-face diplomacy might be important. Now, admittedly, a lot of the studies that have been done, and I've talked about in terms of the mirroring system, has been done in monkeys. But they are able to do similar types of work in humans as well. And there they show the importance of thinking about intentions, not just necessarily in a motor context, but also in an abstract way, right? Because, for example, you might say, well, Professor Holmes, grabbing a banana and invading a country seem like two very different intentions, right? And I would agree with you. I think that's true. But it turns out that what neuroscientists think are going on in terms of abstract political intentions or abstract social intentions in human beings is essentially equivalent to motor action, right? If I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, I have to go to the grocery store, I have to go to the poultry aisle, I have to get that chicken, I have to get the seasoning for it. This is a series of motor actions, right? It's fundamentally a motor type of thing, right? So it might be the case that, yeah, the banana is different than a country, but I think the lesson is the same, which is to say that the idea of having a system 1 and a system 2, where 1 is very automatic and sort of pre-reflective and subconscious, and the system 2 is the sort of deliberative, slow, conscious type of thought, the metaphor of two separate systems might be a little bit misleading. Because what's happening, I think, instead is things that are happening at the system 1 level are feeding into system 2, and presumably things that are happening at system 2 are also feeding into system 1. So in other words, how I come to understand another person in facial interaction has to do with both what's happening automatically with what's happening reflectively, right? But it's certainly the case that what's happening automatically is feeding into that system 2 as well. So I think that, the metaphor might be useful in terms of thinking about different types of reasoning, but it actually might be misleading if we don't think about the ways that the automatic is flowing into system 2 as well, right? So if you say to me, well, certainly an intention to invade a country is going to involve conscious thought. Certainly a decision to make, an intention regarding a trade deal is going to involve conscious thought. Absolutely. It's going to involve conscious thought, there's no question. But it's also going to involve the sort of pre-reflective automatic type of processing that I've been talking about in this presentation as well. So in the end, I think where this leaves us is essentially a new way of thinking about that old problem of other minds and that old problem of intentions, right? Which is to say, we now have something that's sort of an equivalent of a shared circuit, right? Now, I don't want to take this metaphor too far, but the idea of sort of getting on a similar wavelength with somebody else, like the idea of sort of really fundamentally understanding who they are and what their intentions are and sort of what they represent coming through this face-to-face interaction, I think a lot of the evidence I just talked about sort of supports that notion, right? That there's something about face-to-face interaction that really is different. They just don't get through the letter or a tweet or something along those lines, right? That there is something sort of inherently human about that process. It also suggests that intentional understanding is based on simulation and experience, not on theorization. I don't have to think about what an angry face is. I just know, right? I think similarly in face-to-face interactions, we oftentimes do have a sense of somebody's intentions. We might not know how we know that, but we do. It's a nuanced understanding. It's subtle. We might question it, but I think it's still there, and I think it's important. This is sort of talked about in some literature about as being sort of the intention understanding through the first person. I know what your intentions are because I'm experiencing them for myself. So I think about what you're doing through my own lens, essentially. Now, some people have basically said, okay, the mirroring system in the brain, all of these experiments basically solve the problem of other minds, right? Marco Iacoboni at UCLA says the problem of other minds is not a problem, right? Because if I can sort of simulate the intentions of what's going on with another person in my own brain, then I might not be a mind reader in the way that we normally think about it, but I do have access to your brain. And the way I have access to your brain is I'm doing the same thing in my brain, right? Now, that's a little strong. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think you see the point. If the problem of intentions is the problem of other minds, and this solves the problem of other minds, then the problem of intentions is solved as well. A couple of caveats before we go on. The first is that these neurons, as you might expect, are kind of controversial. People say, well, wait a second, bananas and, fMRIs and monkeys, like it's a little too much to take, right? And I appreciate that. Let me give you 3 different reasons why some people are a little bit skeptical or sort of want to be convinced a little bit more. The first is that the meaning of neurons firing is not always clear, right? I alluded to this a second ago, but what is an intention really at the end of the day? Is it really a motor thing? Is an intention something that can be sort of looked at in the brain in the way that we've been talking about it? You might not think so. You might say something like, well, no, intentions are a more philosophical concept. Sure, they might involve brain things going on, but at some level, everything involves brain things, so that doesn't really help us that much, right? So, I mean, there are very smart people that make that type of argument, and I'm sympathetic to it, right? It could be that intention is a lot more philosophical in nature than simply thinking about it in terms of like the equivalent of a motor action. The second thing is that these are difficult to study in humans. So fMRI is a little clunky, right? It'd be very difficult for me to get Donald Trump to get in an fMRI and have an interaction with somebody, right? For lots of different reasons, but one of them is that it's just very clunky technology, right? The real gold standard is being able to actually insert electrodes inside the brain. That's not going to happen anytime soon with any buddy that sort of matters in terms of policy making, and it also just doesn't happen very often, generally speaking, right? Because it's normally people who have been in serious accidents, for example, where you have the opportunity to do studies on the brain because you have access to it. So it's not like you can just walk into a lab and sign up for a study and then they can really get inside your brain and understand what's going on. It doesn't work that way. So consequently, a lot of the things that we want to know about how this works in human beings, we're still trying to figure out. And that leads me to the third one, which is that, this mirroring system was discovered in the 1990s. There's been a lot of work, since 1995 looking at this. But the science is still pretty young, right? We're still at the point where we're still, we're kind of learning about what's going on with this mirroring system. there's going to be more that we find out over time. And so that might have us revise kind of what it is that we think we know, which to me is fine. That's the way science is supposed to work. But people point out that, okay, maybe you think that, or we think that these neurons are really important now, might turn out down the road that they're not as important. And if that happens, so be it. So the question, though, is what do we do with this? So, Professor Holmes, do you want to sort of reduce politics to biochemicals and neurons? No, that's not what I want to do. What I want to do, though, is say, all right, let's take that theory that we had before, the Three Horsemen. This is why diplomacy is irrelevant, right? And if we have evidence that those Three Horsemen might actually be wrong, then we should revise our theory. We should have a new theory. The new theory should be something like, we can understand somebody's intentions, we do it through face-to-face interaction, and we do it through simulation. That's the new theory. So whereas the old theory was, you can't have access to the intentions, my new theory is you can in face-to-face context, and specifically for specific intentions, you can simulate those. Because that's what the science suggests, right? So we're not sort of reducing everything that happens in politics to what goes on in the brain, nor do I think we should do that, but rather just challenging, in effect, what one or two or three of the assumptions are regarding why face-to-face diplomacy is maybe not all that relevant, and then seeing if we can build a new theory based on the new data that we have with respect to how the brain might be working. Okay. I'm going to close by thinking about this last puzzle that I alluded to or hinted at a few minutes ago, which is at the end of the Cold War, you basically had a situation where Ronald Reagan in 1983 goes from calling the Soviet Union the evil empire to 1988, the Soviet Union is now our partner in peace, right? In a very short period of time, the Cold War went from being evil empire to partner in peace. Soviet Union are the bad guys, and now they're the good guys. How did that happen? How did we get to that point? There's a lot of different explanations for this, but let me tell you what I think actually went on here. So Mikhail Gorbachev comes into power, and he's got some new sort of ways of thinking about dealing with the West. He kind of wants to rebuild the relationship that the Soviet Union has with the West, but, particularly the United States. And he does what political scientists would normally say you should do. And it's what I said we should do, the political science said we should do at the beginning of this talk, which is, if you want to show that you're serious, you send a costly signal, okay? So July 1985, Soviet Union announces that it's going to unilaterally end any nuclear explosions. There you go. We're not doing any more nuclear tests. We're done, okay? That's costly to the Soviet Union. Political scientists say that's exactly what you should do. Only problem is it didn't work. And it didn't work because U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz said, history has shown us that when the Soviets feel they need to test, they'll break out of it with a bang. In other words, the United States was looking for all kinds of reasons to discount this costly signal. The Soviets might have thought they were doing something costly, but the United States was saying, not costly enough, we don't buy it, right? They were saying, Soviet Union will start testing again when they need to. All the Soviet Union is showing us is they don't need to test right now, okay? So it also engages that future uncertainty problem a little bit too, right? So in August, what the United States does is they respond with their own nuclear tests, right? So in other words, the United States says, I'll take your costly signal, show you that doesn't mean anything, and we're going to have our own test, right? The other thing that's happening at the time, too, is Reagan starts ratcheting up his discussion of the Strategic Defense Initiative. So this is a sort of complex idea that Reagan and a couple of other, or not a couple, many other administrators in the government had at the time, which was, we can use science and engineering to figure out a way to prevent nuclear strikes from happening in the United States, right? They called it Star Wars because some of the ideas were kind of out there. They were going to use lasers to like knock out nuclear weapons in the sky, and they were going to use missiles to shoot at the other missiles that were on their way. But the basic idea was to create like a dome type of defense system where you could use weapons of your own to destroy the weapons that were coming from the Soviet Union or any other actor, right? And that's going to be kind of problematic because the Soviets get very nervous about that. Now, Reagan, for his part, when he comes to power, also kind of has the idea of wanting a restart, right? He's very serious about the notion that a nuclear war can never be fought. He thinks that a nuclear war will not be, end well for anybody. It'll be basically annihilation. So he wants to avoid that, right? He basically comes in with the same idea that Gorbachev does. Gorbachev doesn't want to fight a war. Neither does Ronald Reagan, okay? Now, one of the interesting things that happens early on in Reagan's presidency is the so-called Able Archer crisis. And this was a profound moment in time, because what ended up happening was there was a NATO exercise where they were basically mobilizing a lot of military. And the history on this is a little sort of controversial. Some people don't really agree as exactly what happened. But the basic idea was that there were at least some people in the Soviet Union who thought that this exercise might actually be real. And they got worried about it. In other words, they saw NATO basically mobilizing, and they were like, this isn't an exercise. They're actually going to get ready to attack us, right? So you can imagine in 1983 how scary that is, right? That's a moment where you almost have a nuclear crisis because of a misperception of what's going on with NATO. Now, Reagan, in January 1984, hears that the Soviet Union thought that this might be real, and he's shocked. He says, do you suppose they really believe that? I don't see how they would believe it, but it's something to think about, right? In other words, Reagan can't comprehend that the Soviets might think that this was real, because Reagan is thinking, our intentions are clear. Obviously, that was just an exercise, right? But what he's missing out on is that the Soviets don't think it's so clear, because they don't have access to those intentions that Reagan does, because, again, those exist in his head. Caspar Weinberger says the Russians had no need to worry about the Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative, because they know perfectly well that we will never launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. And what Reagan realizes is, through all this discussion, where he starts to realize that, oh, the Soviets don't like the idea of SDI, oh, the Soviets thought we were actually going to invade with NATO, he says, I need to get in a room with somebody. I need to sit down with a Soviet leader and explain our position. He says, I was even more anxious to get a top Soviet leader in a room alone and try to convince him that we had no designs on the Soviet Union and Russians had nothing to fear from us. In other words, his intuition is, if I could just meet with somebody personally in a human connection, I can explain all this. That's what he does. That's what he tries to do, right? So he goes over and he has this meeting in Geneva in November 1985 with Mikhail Gorbachev. They have lots of different sessions. They have their photo op, of course. They do, the sort of like really substantive, in the weeds type of discussion. Then they also have dinners and all that kind of stuff. It's all very, very pleasant. This is a meeting where they had a bunch of advisors and translators and all that kind of thing around as well. But what's really important, I think, for the purposes of the argument that I'm making, is to think about what actually happened, right? What were the words that were used? So on day one, Reagan says, the goal here is to eliminate the suspicions that we have of each other. The resolution of other questions will follow naturally from this, right? In other words, he is sort of picking up on the logic that I've been explaining for the last bit of time here, which is that I just need to be able to show the other side they don't have to be suspicious of me. If we can resolve that, then everything else will flow from that. Now, on the specific question of the SDI, right? Reagan and Gorbachev had very different positions. Gorbachev didn't like SDI because what the Americans were basically saying is, we have a bunch of weapons that we're going to shoot up into the sky to blow away your weapons. Okay? And what Gorbachev says is, how do I know you're going to use those weapons for defense? You could just as easily use those weapons for offense. And Reagan says, no, we can distinguish between the weapons. They're not the same at all, and this and that, right? So basically what Gorbachev is saying is that this is going to lead to an arms race in space, not just a defensive arms race, but an offensive arms race with space weapons. Reagan says, no, we'll open up our facilities. Everything will be fine. We'll be able to convince you that these weapons are just going to be used for defense. Don't worry about it, right? And Gorbachev, and this is, I think, the really important quote, Gorbachev says, Mr. President, I don't agree with you on this idea that you can distinguish between offensive and defensive weapons, but I can see that you really mean what you say, right? And I think what Gorbachev is basically revealing here is, I am picking up from Reagan that while I might disagree with what he's saying, disagree with the tactics that he's using, disagree with his position, I can see that he's being sincere. When he tells me that he's using this for defensive purposes, and even if we can't distinguish offensive and defensive weapons, I know that he's being sincere here, because I can see it, right? I can see that you really mean what you say. Now, this is just one quote. There are others, but this, I think, is a nice example of sort of what I'm talking about here, which is that what face-to-face provided in this context was, I can match up what the person is saying to me with the cues and the nuances and all the subtle stuff that I've been talking about that give me a sense of whether or not he's being sincere. And because he was being sincere, this, I think, was really an important moment in kind of getting the United States and the Soviet Union to a point where they could start to talk about arms reductions and eventually end the Cold War, not with a big explosion, which a lot of people were afraid of, obviously, but with a whimper rather than a bang. So What do I take from this? Well, at the end of the day, I think Reagan and Gorbachev were basically able to reconceptualize their interests with one another. They sat down and said, you know, turns out my interests are similar to his interests. His interests are my interests. We're both interested in not having a war. We're both interested in not having nuclear annihilation, right? So they both kind of got it. They just need to be able to explain to the other side that they were being sincere, right? So in other words, their identities and interests did, in a sense, change through diplomacy because they came to understand what the other side wanted and understood where they were coming from. It's also fascinating, by the way, to compare people like Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, to Reagan. Reagan had the benefit of having this interaction face-to-face. Caspar Weinberger didn't. So it was the people back in Washington who were getting reports about what the Soviet Union was doing that were very hawkish about the Soviet Union. They were saying, you know, boy, we can't trust these guys. You know, we got to make sure that they're not going to try to pull the wool over our eyes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Yet the ones that met with Soviet leadership like Reagan come to a very different understanding. And this actually becomes important because there will be conflicts in the Reagan administration between the people like Reagan who had the sort of intention of understanding through face-to-face diplomacy and the people who didn't, but were looking at intelligence estimates and things like that. That becomes a crucial part of the story later on. But I think it's the face-to-face interaction that these two leaders had that really kind of set off this whole thing. Okay, so where does that leave us? Let me sort of sum up the argument today. So there are a bunch of reasons why political scientists are skeptical of face-to-face diplomacy, right? One of them has to do with the origin of political interest. I think what I tried to show you today is that, in fact, these can come from diplomacy. If you can get both sides to understand that their interests are aligned, then they stop seeing the other side as the enemy. They start seeing the other side as somebody like them. And then eventually they start seeing each other as a partner. That explains how the Soviet Union went from evil empire to partner in peace in a very short period of time. That through face-to-face diplomacy, they were able to reconceptualize their relationship vis-a-vis one another. The other thing is that there's a problem that political scientists point out, the problem of signaling, right? Well, here too, I think face-to-face diplomacy really helped. It was only through those face-to-face interactions that Reagan and Gorbachev were able to understand one another. Because before that, they were sending the costly signals and they were, doing NATO exercises, and it wasn't going very well. They sit down, they meet, they share humanity with one another. They realize that, okay, this guy's being sincere. I think I can trust him. And then we're off to the races after that, right? But it only happens, I think, because of that face-to-face interaction. Now, the last one, future uncertainty. I will grant you that this is still an issue, right? I don't have a great way to get around this, right? Leaders are still worried about the fact that on November 3rd, Trump might lose the election, and then you have a new president come in January, right? Or Trump might win the election and continue to be the president in January. That is a huge source of uncertainty for anybody dealing business with the United States, right? And that's just a small example, but we know that, over time states change, their identities change, right? So Germany, for example, has been a very different state over the course of the 20th century, right? So you think about these things and you say, yeah, this is still a problem. Like, I just don't know what's going to happen, in a particular country or with particular leaders, right? And I think that will continue to be an issue. The one mini solution that I have, though, is that if face-to-face interaction is about intention understanding, seeing where we are going in the future can be thought of as being about intentions, right? So more iterative face-to-face interaction, I think, is better than less face-to-face interaction. Now, under COVID-19, obviously, we have a problem, and that is we can't do this very often. Face-to-face interaction has been curbed. You basically have a situation where states are interacting virtually over Zoom or Skype or other types of technologies. And I don't think that it's the same. It's probably better than nothing, but there are reasons that I gave you today that you should be skeptical of the ability of Zoom diplomacy, for example, to basically do the same thing as regular face-to-face diplomacy. And the one big one is, if the cues that you get are very subtle, then any type of digital representation, even the best technology in the world at the moment, is a representation that's not perfect. Right? And so if face-to-face diplomacy is at least partially about picking up on nuance and subtlety, then any type of reduction in information richness is going to hinder that prospect, right? So while I think that Zoom diplomacy is useful in the current pandemic, I don't think it's a replacement for face-to-face diplomacy, but I do think that more face-to-face diplomacy is probably better than less, and it might be one of the ways that we can basically, have states understand each other's intentions, and then also deal with the future uncertainty problem going forward. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope everybody stays safe.